Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin, and we're going to be talking about miracles for the next half hour, A Course in Miracles. Our guest is Judith Skutch, president of the Foundation for Inner Peace and publisher of A Course in Miracles. Judith Skutch is a former faculty member of New York University who taught courses in the exploration of consciousness. First, most obvious question, what is A Course in Miracles?
Well, Charlie, I'll try to be brief. It's 3 books, and it's a system for change of mind, the change of mind that leads to inner peace. I could say a mouthful, which is that it's a metaphysical system of spiritual psychotherapy. Any one of those words is a real loaded word, but in truth, that's what it is. Metaphysical because it's talking about the reality as spirit, not the physical body of the physical world. And spiritual, of course, the basis is spirit that it's talking about. And psychotherapy because it's a change of mind or a healing of the mind.
Is it similar to anything else that we might be familiar with? Any other texts that are available now? The Bible, for example, isn't that one of the underlying reasons for the Bible or some of the Eastern traditions that have been written?
Actually, I could say it's similar to everything that speaks truth as we know it. I'm talking about, again, a metaphysical truth. The only difference, as far as I can see in A Course in Miracles, is the way it combines Eastern and Western mysticism or thought and the disciplines of the mind. It also, yes, definitely draws from the Bible. It doesn't replace the Bible. It's not a religion, by the way, or a cult. Definitely not. It's a tool. It's a spiritual self-help tool that one reads, or you can say takes, like a course, to help one achieve a more peaceful existence.
Where did it come from? How did it come about?
Well, that to me is really one of the most interesting parts of the story. I came upon the manuscript, it wasn't then published, at Columbia University School of Physicians and Surgeons. 2 people who were professors of psychology at Columbia University had asked a question, and the question came out of a long-term working relationship they had with each other. They were both on the staff there and had worked closely together. And they noticed that there was a great deal of stress in their environment and disharmony between them. And one day, and this is, of course, I'm really playing it down, one day, one of them sort of had a breaking point. He said to his associate, a woman, "I don't know what we're doing wrong. Nothing seems to be going right in our personal lives. Although our professional lives are successful, it doesn't seem fulfilling. There must be a better way to live in the world than this." And the woman, named Helen, who was responsive to him intellectually, was kind of startled by the emotion with which he asked that question. And she turned to him strangely, moved by the passion with which he uttered it. And she said, "I don't know what better way there could be than the ways we know. We're psychologists, after all. We should know the many ways of living there are in the world. But whatever a better way is, I'll look for it with you. I'll join you to help you find it." To me, that's a very important decision when 2 people come together to try to find a more harmonious way of being. And their decision to come together and find this better way resulted in 3 months in 1965 of heightened psychic imagery that Helen had. We all have sort of thoughts and visions and pictures in our mind we pay not much attention to. But in this case, it was very heightened. It was very noticeable. And these inner visions, or heightened imagery that Helen called it, led to her being able to clearly hear her inner voice. And we all, again, dialogue with something in there. She was able to be apart from that. In other words, one voice seemed stronger, more authoritative, and clearer than her regular, everyday ego personality voice. And she actually heard one day, "This is A Course in Miracles. Please take notes." She was so threatened by these experiences. After all, she was a scientist, and also she was a psychologist, and their clinical patients are the kind of people who had these experiences, not them. So she called her associate at home and said, "I'm hearing that voice I told you about. It's very strange. It's saying, 'This is A Course in Miracles. Please take notes.'" And he suggested that she takes very fast dictation. He had seen her in faculty meetings scribbling away in her shorthand, that she might indeed start listening to this inner process, which he recognizes, perhaps creativity, and take down what it said, which she did. She was concerned, of course, that it might be gibberish and they would think she was crazy. So what she did was she took down what she heard internally, which she said was more like an inner tape recorder, and she brought it into their office, which they shared early in the morning, and before their staff came in, they locked the door and pulled down the shade, and she read aloud from her shorthand notes, and he typed it up. And that's how A Course in Miracles came into being. Over a 10-year period of time, this lady, at any time she chose, would attune herself to that inner process without looking at what she'd scribed before. She was able to tune in and take down what she was hearing. And he would type it up from her notes, and then they would read it together. It's quite startling because a metaphysical system of thought was the opposite of everything they had been taught and were teaching.
When you talk about a system of thought, can you give me a specific, something that we could sort of hone in on, that would be what sorts of, I would call them revelations, what sorts of revelations was she dealing with?
Well, I'll give you a specific lesson from A Course in Miracles, which I think people can use right away. And this is probably one of the hardest, so I'll start with the hardest first. Based upon the philosophy that our spiritual reality is eternal and is invulnerable to attack, even though our bodies certainly can seem to be hurt, in my defenselessness my safety lies, is one of the working lessons from A Course in Miracles. To practice that with everyone you meet, in other words, show your defenselessness, and you will not then be attacked. That's where your safety is just the opposite of the way the world seems to work. Can you imagine what that would bode to the MX plan, for instance?
Defenselessness.
Yes. I think what we need in this country, by the way, if we are to follow a spiritual method of governance, is a Secretary of Defenselessness.
Okay. How did you get involved?
Well, I had been for a long time a student of parapsychology. Academically, I was studying the research into consciousness and how limitless we really are. I had done work and studied at New York University, had sponsored research through a foundation I established with my husband at Stanford Research Institute, Princeton, Harvard. I had joined with Edgar Mitchell, who was an ex-astronaut. He was the sixth man to walk on the moon. An institute here in San Francisco called Institute of Noetic Sciences, noetic coming from the word nous, or knowing, inner knowing. And again, this was dedicated to scientific exploration of consciousness. And I had gone a long way in this. In fact, I was not only convinced, I was positive at this point, both through my intellect and experientially, that we are indeed much less limited than we think, which again can be applied to healing, it can be applied to peace of mind, to all the things we seem to desire. But somehow inside of me, I was feeling a lack of connection. I can't put my finger on what it was exactly, although years later I told my story to a woman I admire tremendously named Mother Teresa. The world seems to know her quite well these days. And she said, "Oh, my dear, you were suffering then from a disease that's endemic in the world today." And I said, "Oh, it had a name? I never knew that. What?" And she said, "It's called spiritual deprivation." And I thought, spiritual deprivation, it's a plague? And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Is there any antidote?" "Oh, yes," she said. "There is a cure for it. It's called love, and thank God it's contagious." So at that point, I think I was suffering from that spiritual deprivation. And this comes to 1975 in my life, and I was very busy. I had an interesting career. I was lecturing, teaching. Didn't have to work for a living. I had healthy children, productive family life. But again, that emptiness was inside. And it was so extreme that one night I really asked that universal question that people in extremis seem to ask, "Won't someone up there please help me?" And I didn't define what that someone else up there had to be. And just a few days later, I was introduced to these two professors who had the manuscript called A Course in Miracles, which had been finished just recently, and they were willing to share it with me. Now, you could say that it was all a setup job. Cosmic consciousness or the universe had arranged for this to happen, but the instant I saw it, somehow or other, I knew that my hunger was about to be slated. And it's been, over 8 years, and I still feel that way.
Where are these original scribes now, these two individuals?
The woman who did the hearing, we call the scribe, Helen, died 2 years ago in New York City after she retired from Columbia. And her associate and partner, Dr. William Thetford, is here in San Francisco in the Tiburon area.
Okay. Now, after you had read the manuscript, what did you do then?
Well, the first thing I did is I started to study it. It is a self-study course, and I'm a very poor student, so I had two wonderful people who were the scribes of A Course in Miracles to help me understand what it was saying. I found it difficult intellectually and very challenging, and yet somehow or other inside I recognized it was true for me. And then I started sharing it with others. Since I was a teacher and a lecturer, I asked them, is it all right if I tell people about this? And their immediate answer was, not here in New York. So many of my trips to California, I did share it here in San Francisco, the Greater Bay Area, and I noticed that people were as hungry as I for this particular form. We started to Xerox many copies and pass them around. It was expensive, Xeroxing 1,500 pages, and sooner or later it became evident it was to be published. A few publishers wanted to do it, but they all wanted to cut it. It's such a long document, and that didn't seem to be right, so we eventually did it ourselves. And that's how I came to be a publisher.
It is now published, and how many volumes?
There are 3 volumes that go together. You can't get them individually. They would have been in one, but it would be too thick. There is a text which sets forth the principles of A Course in Miracles, and then a workbook which is necessary in order for you to use them. It's one thing reading something intellectually, it's something very different practicing it. And the only way you're going to know if it works is to try it. And then, so that workbook exists, a lesson a day for 365 days. It's almost impossible to even get any advantage from it unless you make that kind of commitment. And then there's a teacher's manual which addresses itself to your teaching yourself and talks about the role of teachers and learners in the world, with each and every one of us having an internal teacher which knows what's best for us. And those 3 volumes comprise A Course in Miracles.
You said it's not a religion and it's not a cult. Is it something that is being practiced in groups, or is it strictly an individual approach? Are there study groups that have been formed here in the Bay Area or elsewhere that are taking up these principles?
It is a self-study course and does not need anyone to participate with you if you choose not to. But we seem to be sociable animals, and I know that I find comfort in groups. And so what I did was to reach out to others to help me, and that seemed to be a very good way to go. But the groups that have formed all over the country now, and there are thousands of them, literally, Charlie, are self-defined. There is no organization here, no structure, no dues, no membership, and no one to tell you how to do it. People reach out to each other and say, meet once a week in my house, or maybe a church, or maybe a school, and we'll have a group. But it's not necessary, really not.
The title, A Course in Miracles, the word miracle is a very strong word, and it reaches out and grabs people, but probably in a 1,000 or 100,000 ways. Could you help us understand what, in this context, a miracle is?
Yes, A Course in Miracles is very specific as to its definition of a miracle. First, it talks about our natural identity. It says we are created by our Creator, God if you like, in our Creator's image, as spirit, not as physical bodies, as spirit. And our property is love. And of course, along with love comes peace. When we do not see that, which is here we are in our everyday world, we hardly ever see evidence of that in our lives, we're in trouble, and we are not paying attention to what we truly are. The miracle, then, is something that happens in our physical domain that helps us shift our perception from the physical body as defining us and the physical world as our only reality to the spiritual. Now, some people tell me it's a miracle when they're driving along a crowded street and have to park in order to go to work or go to the doctor, and all of a sudden they visualize some car is going to pull out right in front of my office or the doctor's building, and it does. In a sense, that could also be conceived of as a miracle under this definition, because what is it for? It shows, number one, that we are not alone, that minds are connected, that the source is God. And anything that reminds you of your source in that extent would be a miracle. It would really depend upon if your perception has been changed.
I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about your, and maybe it has no relevance at all, but could you talk about your religious or spiritual background previous to becoming involved in the Course in Miracles?
Absolutely, and I think it has relevance because it shows that we come from all different traditions and we can still use a tool that helps us understand what in truth we are. And I was educated, born and educated Jewish. And when I say born and educated, many people in all traditions can be just born to a family that embraces that tradition. But I was very strongly educated in Judaism. And in fact, for a while I taught Hebrew when I was at college. And so that tradition was a very important part of my life and still is. I see A Course in Miracles as not conflicting with what I practice, because the kind of peace we're talking about is the essence of every tradition. And I can find references, biblical and in the Torah, for instance, to the way we get along with each other and the harmony with which we are meant to exist. A Course in Miracles really, I mean, if I'm going to be very descriptive about it, is a method that helps you practice forgiveness. And the Bible tells us to love thy neighbor as thyself, but nowhere does it say how. And we really want to, but we don't know how to begin because he or she does something that we don't like. And going to the far extreme, there's someone like Hitler, and millions of people get exterminated. You know, how can you forgive a Hitler? How can you forgive your next-door neighbor for putting up a fence between your properties and defacing your garden? How can you forgive your daughter for not calling you every week when she goes to college? A Course in Miracles helps you understand what is at the basis of forgiveness, and understanding what the basis of forgiveness is, which is recognizing that what you thought someone did to you may have happened in the ego, personal, physical world, but at the basis of spirit, which is your true identity, doesn't exist. On that level, seeing the spark of the divine, the God within someone else, you can indeed look past the error of the personal and truly know that other being. And in that moment, that magical, mystical, miraculous moment, everything is over. Relationships get healed. So then I could say A Course in Miracles is a method of healing relationships, and that's where it's relevant to me in my daily life, because I find that the relationships that I found difficult in the past, using this in my life as my own personal process, have undergone extraordinary transformations, and I feel better.
As an outsider, I might ask why these people who originally came up with these principles and concepts and put this work together, why this era, why the United States, why not New York, and why California as a jumping off point. Do you have any of the answers to those kinds of why questions? Have you figured out, you talked about your personal desire to find something, you were seeking something when you found the Course in Miracles, but has it become any clearer to you why you were involved?
I think, again, you know, we talk on levels. I could never say I have proof positive of this, but I can tell you there's a feeling. It seemed to me, for instance, when I met these two people for the first time, that there was no past between us, that somehow or other there was a spark of recognition in me that many people have when they meet someone for the first time and say, I don't know how, but I really know him or her. I had that, almost as if we had been together before, and somehow or other were being reunited, if you like, for a particular function, a particular job. And so I asked all the questions you're asking me now of the two people who took this down. Why did it come, for instance, in Christian terminology, to a militant Jewish atheist? And that's what Helen, who took down A Course in Miracles, was. She was born Jewish, and she was a militant atheist most of her life. Why? Why her? And why a man, Bill Thetford, who says that he was agnostic and never the least bit interested in spiritual things, which he thought was fuzzy-headed, soft-mindedness? Well, the answers that they got when they asked that question internally, and she heard the dictated inner answer, was, first of all, that on some level they weren't yet aware of, they had volunteered to do this job, indicating there is another level of awareness. Well, I had come from years and years of parapsychological investigation. I believe that automatically. And then why now? And in this form, the answer they got was the world as we know it has never before been on such a brink of chaos. And people from all over are asking for help. And it's coming through in as many forms as people can accept. And it will come through in art and in medicine, in politics and science, in the ecological movement, in as many ways as there are ideas to correct our misperception of what we are. And again, why these particular two people? Because somehow or other they had said they would do the job. And that sounded so right to me, because when I met them, somehow or other I knew I was supposed to stay with them. And I'd never had that experience before.
It's a question sometimes of whether I guess it's a chicken and egg kind of question, and I'm thinking of popular entertainment. But there is currently a television program, which is a relatively popular television program, which is based on, and one of the key characters in the series has psychic abilities and has the ability to see things and perceive things and gets hunches and whatnot and acts on them. I'm wondering if that kind of atmosphere, a program like Infinity, where we deal with all sorts of aspects of the consciousness movement and the heightened awareness of the consciousness movement in our society, I wonder if that is going to create an environment where this type of work and this type of approach will be more accepted than it would have been 10, 15 years ago, or might have been in some other culture or some other society, some other part of the world.
I think very definitely so. Having been involved in the academic side and the scientific of consciousness exploration and research, I have seen in the last 20 years a tremendous surge of interest, say from 10 to 5 years ago, so that now it's exponential, whereas you could never have a program on television before that people would even tune into more than once. Now I notice 4 out of 5 programs that I just happen to flip on during any given month have a great deal of references to the inner world or to the psychic, if not actually to the spiritual. And if you take a look at the publishers' lists today, some of the books that are really leading sales are those that are exploring the inner domain. I think possibly when we took the first step on the moon, we also recognized that we needed to be just not astronauts or cosmonauts, but innernauts, and that they go together. That kind of exploration is very necessary.
Would you imagine there are many people living today who don't need A Course in Miracles?
I think we all need something that will help us live more harmonious lives in touch with our essence. And I have come across maybe a bare handful of people who seem to have that presence about them, that aura of peace that I like to be in. Whether or not they maintain it on a continuous level, I don't know. But again, Mother Teresa in my life has been one of those, so I look to the models that demonstrate this. I imagine it could have been that Schweitzer could have been that kind of a person. Again, probably not consistently. Certainly we have historical precedent in the great religious leaders of the world. We seem to admire those people most who demonstrate that, the Gandhis of our time. I don't think a movie such as Gandhi could have been made 30 years ago or 20 years ago, even if Gandhi had existed that many decades before. I think we really are getting more and more ready for this message.
Let's talk about some of you've brought in a world perspective. Let's talk about some of the problems in the world. Could you give us you talked about defenselessness early on. What are some of the other principles of the Course that could be applied to the problems we have in the world today? Nuclear war, you said if we had a Secretary of Defenselessness nation or something of that sort. World hunger, unemployment, poverty.
There's a line in the Course in Miracles that I really love, and I remind myself to think of it at times like this, because I get very tempted, as everyone else, to start complaining about the government, or the weather, or whatever the outside influences are that seem to victimize us. And the line that I love in the Course that I remind myself of is, seek not to change the world, but change instead your mind about it. And that's a very powerful thought for me. In every situation that I'm in personally, if I see myself as being attacked by external influences, another person or conditions, then I'm going to react that way. I have to remember that I've chosen that first. If I change my mind about basically what I am and feel myself invulnerable, something happens to the situation, the miracle. Something happens with other individual. Something happens to the stock market. Something happens to the classroom full of hostile people. Something happens to the script I'm working on, whatever. It's that inner shift in my own mind that I must take responsibility for that seems to make the changes. And I look again to the models in my life for that external statement. For instance, do you remember, not long ago, Mother Teresa decided that nobody was paying any attention to the children in Beirut, all those homeless children whose parents had been killed and they were wandering around the streets in packs. And she literally said, "Stop the war, I'm coming in." And she did. Now, who could imagine a thing like that except a woman who walks as she does? And when she took them out, I don't know how many, few hundred in an airlift, the war went right back on. If we have those models, and something in us honors them, which it does, then I think we could start to see changes made. But the change has to come from within each individual. We can't expect large blocks of energy to move themselves around. We can't look at the nuclear situation and be fearful, or we're going to do exactly what we're doing and think we're right.
It's a difficult step to take, though. If you are a Mother Teresa, you can do it just on the will of the moment and charge ahead. But most people, it's like learning to swim. You know, you know that you should be able to do it, and you've seen other people do it, and yet when you get in the water, if you panic just a little bit and you start swallowing it, you go under. It's not something that can be accomplished overnight, or is it?
I I think that there are some requisites in order to achieve that attitude. And briefly, they seem to be, in my mind at least, this. First of all, that you're willing to. That you are openly willing to. You may not think you're able to, but that you're willing to. Second, that you call upon something more than yourself, and I don't care what you call it, something higher than your inner self, your higher self, God, whatever name you use, it doesn't matter, realizing that you really can't do it alone from your smaller personal ego self because you see limitations there. So you appeal to the limitless within you, and through prayer or just plain asking, again, whatever you call it, ask for that kind of assistance. And then, indeed, you do see things happen. It does work. When you start to see it work in your life, then you become stronger and stronger. I think it's like training for the Olympics. You do a little bit at a time. You don't decide you want to run the 4-minute mile and with no training, run outside and do it. What you do is a little at a time where you get more and more faith and more belief in your ability to change your mind because you get more and more instances of peace happening. And so I think, yes, it's perfectly possible, and that us ordinary individuals are capable of that kind of a change.
Would you give me a specific example of how the Course has changed your life, something that wasn't right and now has really been fixed up?
That would probably take too long because every time I think of something that isn't quite right, I mean relationships. And I can just testify that I have a long way to go, but I have never felt such gratitude, satisfaction in the way my relationships are right now. But I will give you an example of how I released fear. And I was traveling in a New York City subway where I lived a few years ago, and I had heard the night before on television that a young woman was robbed and raped and murdered in a car by 2 or 3 young people when they were the only ones in the car. I was thinking of that when I got into the subway midday. It was not heavily crowded at that time. In fact, I got into a car with 3 young men sitting opposite me, and I was the only other occupant. And I started to think about what had happened the day before and wonder whether or not I was going to have such an incident when all of a sudden the young men who were whispering among themselves and seemed to be probably on drugs, one of them got up by agreement and started to approach me menacingly. There was no question in my mind that this guy wanted to take my purse or goodness knows what else. And I was paralyzed by fear that instant. I was working that day on a lesson that somehow or other I remembered. And it was, miracles are seen in light. And light and love are one. And I closed my eyes for a second and I said an inner help because there was nothing else for me to do. When I opened my eyes, something extraordinary had happened. I didn't see 3 menacing young men. I saw light. It happened in just a second, but that subway car was full of the most radiant, uplifting, beautiful, safe light I have ever experienced. And involuntarily I started to smile. It happened in such a millisecond that the young man who was walking towards me stopped transfixed, perhaps at the look on my face. Maybe it was bliss. And at first it seemed strange, and then he started to smile at me, and then his 2 friends across the aisle started to smile, and before we knew it, we were all laughing, and the train came to a stop and lurched, and my purse fell off my lap. He jumped, picked it up, gave it back to me, and said, "Have a good day, ma'am," and he left the train.
Projections for the future for the Course. If it is accepted, you said thousands of people are involved already. If it should grow as it is growing, what can we accomplish in the world?
I think, again, Charlie, this is one of many tools. I don't see A Course in Miracles as saving the world. I see people changing their minds about each other as the saviors. But a tool like this, and many others exist equally as good, could certainly be applied by all those who start to get an inkling that the true responsibility for world change lies within their own minds and their attitudes. And in case you're interested in numbers, right now there are about 142,000 students of A Course in Miracles, which, by the way, has never been advertised. It just seems to flow through word of mouth or people who write an article because they themselves have worked with it. And it's distributed that way. And it's distributed by a not-for-profit foundation.